tirs,
des explosifs, des missiles,
commandant minutieusement mis en scène.
Tirer l'attention, science artificielle, des méga-feux comme en Gironde.
Hello everyone and welcome here at the Abbaye aux Dames in Caen, and thank you to be so numerous participating in the 7th edition of the World Forum Normandy for Peace. Yes, 7 years already. Next to me, she has been with us since the beginning of this adventure. She's the founder of the Imagine NGO, recognized officially by the United Nations. Everybody knows her, Frédérique Bedos. Thank you. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. It is a big joy to meet you here. He is the inventor of Normandy for Peace, vice president of Region Normandy in charge of European affairs and the promotion of Normandy, Francois-Xavier Priolo. I see that our president is clapping very hard. That's good for my future career. Ladies and gentlemen, at the moment we have the 79th General Assembly of the United Nations, and early this week, next to this Assembly of Generals, there was the Summit for the Future. War in Ukraine, Middle East in fire, conflict between US and China, artificial intelligence, all this of course fragilizes the capacity of nations to act together in order to meet the big planetary challenges. The Olympic Games for a time of a summer have reminded us what a brotherly planet could look like. The international community is fractioning over. We need to bring order back in the planetary chaos and create trust again. In this generalized period of distrust, the future is, of course, can only happen with the help of the future, the youth. And as you know, the youth is the DNA of our forum. We have thousands of high schoolers. That's a big pride. And I would like to thank the sub-students here. They come from the Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon, a God-forsaken archipelago in the northern Atlantic. Here we have also the high schoolers from Jersey, and of the 5 Norman departments that are present, also from other regions, people from Aubervilliers in the Paris regions. You give them a big hand. And this year, a new aspect, we also have French high schools abroad that follow us via video channel, particularly from the Charles de Gaulle Lycée in London. They are connected via video feed. Give them a big hand. We are together for 2 days with a very intense program, 3 big plenary sessions, about 15 thematic and geographic debates, youth workshops, the Village for Peace was the library, photographic exhibitions. If you don't want to miss anything, look at the detailed program that you've received when you joined us. And for all these debates, I would like to thank all the partners. We've been building this event together. About 30 partners, panelists that you're going to listen to during all these 2 days. 150 from our 30 countries representing the 5 continents. I also would like to greet today the listeners from the Collège des Hautes Études Diplomatiques from the Ministry of Europe and Foreign Affairs. Get up. They've been here since yesterday for a seminar. And welcome to Normandy for Peace. Very happy to welcome you for this 2 days. You're welcome. There's many of you here under this big 1,500 people. but you're even more numerous to be connected online, because you know our online is on streaming live on this website Normandy for Peace, on YouTube and on Facebook. Don't forget the hashtag NPP2024. Please comment, please share on social networks, so that for once peace be doing the buzz on the social networks. That wouldn't be bad. And to start straight away, let's review together the main moments of the highlights of last year's sessions.
Résistance.
Quels sont les ressorts de la résistance, le sens profond de la résistance? Pourquoi finalement, au nom de quelles valeurs je me mobilise?
Résister contre qui et pourquoi?
Résister contre toute forme de régime totalitaire ou très autoritaire.
À se battre pour nos droits et nos libertés, parce que dans beaucoup de pays, justement, tout ça c'est un peu mis à mal.
For promoting democracy, I was threatened to be in jail for 20 years.
I am activist against execution because I don't want anyone has this experience which I have.
Le rôle de la jeunesse est très important dans cette paix. Et je m'en vais vous dire que nous, jeunes, nous sommes prêts.
Cette lutte des Ukrainiens concerne nous tous parce qu'ils se battent pour la démocratie, ils se battent pour la paix, ils se battent pour la liberté.
Et c'est pour cela que ces jeunes puissent être inspirés de ce qui peut se faire de mieux en matière de gouvernance publique, de respect des droits, de respect des libertés, et que ces jeunes puissent devenir les vecteurs de la démocratie de demain. Vive la Normandie, vive la démocratie et vive la liberté.
Ladies and gentlemen, this forum is an initiative of the region Normandy. This adventure started 7 years ago, and we measure today how important, how necessary it is to open officially our forum. Please welcome the president of the region Normandy, Hervé Morin. Ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, ambassadors, ministers, state representatives, elected representatives, ladies and gentlemen, thank you, a huge thank you to be here today, and a huge emotional moment for us, the opening each year of this forum. And as my neighbor Nicole Miozotto said 2 minutes ago, there's no other event like this around the world, because it brings together emotion, generosity. It brings together people who know, and the use of Normandy from elsewhere all the way to Aubervilliers and Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon. To us, it's a huge pride to see you so numerous, so enthusiastic, with this capacity of sharing challenges that are major challenges. Thank you 1,000 times. And thank you, of course, to Francois-Xavier Privoliot, Vice President of the region and Major of Louviers, without whom none of this would have been possible. Francois-Xavier, you are exceptional. You are the miracle of the region Normandy. Thank you, Francois-Xavier. Also, thank you to his colleague Frédéric Bedos, who assumes with so much talent and been running this ever since the beginning. Thank you, Frédéric. I only see you once per year, and each year I say you're really the most beautiful couple of the year, you and Francois-Xavier. Thank you to the members of the Scientific Advisory Board, and I would particularly thank Nicole Gnisotto and Bertrand Nadi for their orientations, their guidance, their intelligence, their impertinence, and their capacity each year to build this forum, Normandy for Peace. Thank you to all of you, and thank you to the Scientific Advisory Board who is next with us to build Normandy for Peace. Thank you 1,000 times to both of you. Thank you also to all the agents of the regions, about the hundreds of voluntary agents that ensure this forum, these debates can happen in the best conditions possible. I would like particularly to thank the European International Department and the team of Julie Miclot. Where is she? Julie, there she is. Thank you, Julie, 1,000 times, and thank you all our co-workers. And there's one thing that I really like each year is the people who are used to participate in this forum saying that it's better organized at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. So, Julie, if one day you want to envision a new career, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs would be very happy to have you and your expertise. And I would like to finish, please give them a huge hand, the young people of the 2 high schools who will be doing the service, who will ensure that these 2 days will be happening in the best conditions. So I would like to thank the high schoolers from Georges Baptiste in Cantleux and from the Lycée Rabelais, because they're the ones who are going to be the ushers, and we ensure that everything will be in the best conditions. So all these high schoolers from these 2 high schools, thank you 1,000 times. Give them a big hand. Ladies and gentlemen, I think that, like you recall the magnificent commemorations of the June 1944, who up until the last breath will be the testimonies of the 6th of June, this day, the longest day, for which I hope we will, generations after generations, to never forgive it, that no one should ever forget the courage of the soldiers who fell in Normandy in Europe. No darkness should ever fall over the efforts of our democracies to build this huge logistical and military province that was the D-Day. Remember what General de Gaulle said: honor to the United Nations that mix their bloods with our blood, their sorrow with our sorrow, their hope with our hope, and that today win together. This is what he said in 1945. Well, since for 7 years the World Forum Normandy for Peace tries to keep this objective of peace and liberty in mind, an objective that is, we know, it's very difficult to reach, and that seems to go further day after day, from Gaza to Kharkiv, from Yemen to Burma, from the Bekaa Plains to Mali. We see on our screens every day these human tragedies, these faces of crying children, these bodies covered in blood, these parents crying their children, columns of refugees running away from the still smoking ruins of the cities, these mass graves filled with mutilated corpses by bullets, by bombs, and sometimes by machetes. This edition 1924 has this world that escapes us. Yeah, it seems that the world is escaping us. It's escaping us, and we don't really know how to work to save the peace, faced with the folly, the madness that seems taking hold of humanity. We observe the systems of peace that we have experimented since 1945, and that seem fairly impotent. Our international institutions, of which the weakness echoes an organization and a governance that is today obsolete. It is clear that a single power, as imperial it may be, cannot impose peace in a part of the world. Neither the United States nor the fragile trio China, Russia, Iran. You can see that the struggle of these three actors is first and foremost a struggle not just against the United States, but it's a struggle of totalitarian countries against democracy and freedom. And as recently Condoleezza Rice said, the future will be shaped by the alliance of democratic and liberal countries, or will be dictated by revisionist and nostalgic powers of a time of territorial conquest and of authoritarian practice. There is no other option, did she say. A balance of power, many specialists, seems completely unrealistic, as in a world constantly changing, a world where new technology, revolution, new technology like artificial intelligence does not just turn our economies and societies on their head. And I'm happy that this year we have half a day to speak about this in a dedicated conference. Also a world where violence and war are so protean that they can take totally implausible turns. I mean, I was discussing with former generals to prepare the speech yesterday, and they said the attack with the beepers from the Israeli army and then with talkie walkers, that is something absolutely unimaginable and unbelievable that no one could even have thought of, and be logistically such a success, if we can speak about success when there's people dying, but with means that were absolutely new and never seen before in our modern conflicts. So as an operational peace system, there is what we've been known since 1945, the peace by contract, by the multitude of conventions, treaties, political and economical systems like we have experienced in the 27 European countries and the United. But for this, you need parliamentarian democracy. You need people who control and decide next to their leaders. Together with their leaders is what a couple of years, someone from at IFRI, when I was teacher at Sciences Politiques, at the political center, who said that this positive system could only work under two conditions. The first is that democracy resisting populism and the rise of nationalism, that the horned beast, as the philosopher Nietzsche was saying. And the second condition is that the rationality of the powers are more important, prevail over the most devastating passion. With populism in retreat and reason taking precedence, the battle for peace is far from won. Between the first editions of this forum and today's, war has resurfaced where we thought it would never happen in Eastern Europe. It also threatens regularly the Levant, following the horrific climaxes reached between Hamas and Israel. The barbaric violence of one has triggered the military fury of the other, sowing hatred and the call for revenge for decades to come. And in the end, you can see that this trend is endless. It doesn't have the capacity to find the right words. Reconciliation, forgiveness, fraternity, all words that are forgotten, sadly, after almost a year of the war in the heart of the Middle East, ever more complicated and deadly. This world is beyond our grasp, but there's no way we can give up our desire to build peace. Just like Sisyphus, we will tirelessly push our boulder up the hill. We must remain peacemakers against all odds. That's why I tell the youth, protest, bear witness, propose. Anything but resignation and silence, anything but indifference. It's not the others' world. It's not just the diplomats. It's not the military. It's not just the army or the political leaders. No, this is our case. This is your case of aware people, of instructed, of educated people, of people who have a place in history. I would like to say what Elie Wiesel said, winner of the Nobel Peace Prize. It's our stories. He said, I have sworn never to be silent when human beings endure suffering and humiliation, wherever they may be. We must always take sides. Neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. Silence encourages the persecutor, never the persecuted. Yes, we need to be committed, and this is a place of commitment for peace, for human rights, and for world security. So, of course, we can see that this traditional classical war opposing two countries, possibly armed and great powers, has not become a pure theory. We must never forget in the war between Russia and Ukraine is that we have one of the two powers is a nuclear power, not just with strategic and tactic weapons, but also with tactical nuclear weapons usable on the battlefields. That is a risk condition of which we need to be extremely aware, and so we need to be firm but also be responsible when we deal with this issue. So, ladies and gentlemen, on this Ukrainian issue, let us not forget, we Europeans, what need to be our responsibility. Our responsibility is not to send soldiers on the battlefields of the Ukraine. Our responsibility, first of all, is what Zelensky is asking us, is to provide him weapons and ammunition, not boots on the ground. And so when the French president called up on these questions, he irritated many people, but at last, through what he said, he forced everyone of us to get out of be less and really look at us and say, could we ourselves die for Ukraine, send our soldiers for Ukraine? Could we die for Vilnius, for Warsaw, for Helsinki, just like thousands of soldiers died on the beaches of Normandy in 1944? The foreign relations, ladies and gentlemen, are not international relations. They are not foreign to our citizens, citizens of a democracy. And so behind these issues, what is the commitment of our countries? And being a peacemaker in Russia, it's saying, yes, it is first and foremost building to also a counter proposition and a counter European proposition. And this is what I wanted to finish on. We mentioned the issue of sanctions, saying that maybe the sanction would allow to get Russia back to reason, no more imports, economical issues, inflation, recession. Actually, the Russians found a way to sell their natural gas and their oil to other countries and to maintain their social and economical model. At the same time, we are faced with a war of attrition, where we see in the end the weapons deliveries, the sanctions will hopefully bring back Putin to reason and to the table of negotiation in acceptable conditions for Ukrainians. Of course, within all this, the results of the outcome of the American presidential election will obviously be crucial. And you all remember the ambiguity of Donald Trump saying that he would like solve the issue in 48 hours. We know in the end, we Europeans, we have a responsibility. We have so much trouble actually taking on. I remember when I was Ministry of Defense in 2008, during the French presidency of the European Union, all the propositions that we had presented to build European defense solutions. I was facing a wall of countries who said, no, in the end, the issue is always the same. Let's just hide under the NATO umbrella on a solution that was mainly relying on the US. So we can say that with Ukraine, we have went a step further. We are now progressing in a sense because we had a common response in solidarity, equal response, which was extremely rare on the issues of defense and security. That is probably the first time that we've been able to have Europeans around the table speaking with one voice. But if we look at things in detail, concretely, is there today a common vision for European defense and security? No. Are we willing to build an autonomous strategic model in Europe? So decide, build a political solution, a diplomatic solution, and eventually a military solution? No. At the European level, do we have the capacity to do without NATO or the US? No, absolutely not. In reality, we have not moved forward a single step in 20 years. We have not moved forward so far that we still don't even have a common strategic headquarters at European level. That we systematically need to refer to NATO as soon when we want to do a strategic proposition in terms of security and military operations. And when you look at things in detail, we are still not able to build something that would allow us to build a common foundations in terms of defense of military equipment that would allow us to work towards strategic autonomy. If we look at the bottom line today, we would say that we have more F-35 planes flying in the European plane than we had planes flying from the European manufacturers. So today, in the end, we have still today, we have agreements, we have solutions, we have documents, we have battle groups, we have corps, but and common military units, just like with the Germans, for instance, but there is no real will to build a joint solution that would be a European solution with a Europeanization of the with NATO, which the Americans would like to see as being able to decide a strategic autonomy at our level. That should be the ambition of the Europeans in a world where we can see that the US is progressively pulling back from Europe and are looking more and more towards Asia. So, ladies and gentlemen, as a conclusion, in this dark period, I would like to say that the message of future and hope should be ours. And this message of future and hope is to say first and foremost to everyone who doubt, there is no peace, there is no security if there is no human rights and there is no democracy. It can probably be the most imperfect way of governing people, but without democracy, without freedom of the peoples, you will never have peace and security. This is the lesson that we need to remember each day, even when we doubt it, even when we go and vote, to remember that democracy is the key to peace and security. I thank you and I wish you a great forum.
Eh bien, nous y voici.
Well, here we are. This is the World Peace Forum and it's officially open. This world around us, slowly drifting away from us. How can we avoid violence? Based on this topic, the Science Committee decided to work, and thanks to the chairmanship of Bertrand Badi and Christophe Niesotto, once again we must agree that they find the right topic, because not a single day goes by without having news on TV, in the media, reminding us of the violence in the world. This violence is becoming unprecedented because everything moves faster. Climate change, demographic boom, and new technologies and other things. We must ask ourselves, does this violence force us to face the chaos? But history reminded us that the world now is not more violent than it used to be, but this violence, these types of violence are new. So identifying these new types of violence and to be able to identify them and to fight and tackle these types of violence as the red thread among our two plenary sessions. Let's move on into the first violence, the violence of a shifting world, and all things, this feeling of being powerless, and we may lead to resignation. In order to fight this feeling of powerlessness, we have to will use the plenary session for tomorrow morning in order to find the necessary conditions to tackle this and to get back controls. And we also try to define the priorities and what's most urgent in order to have peace. Once again, this not a forum on war, but on peace, a sustainable peace built with and for the populations. Before moving on, let's have a look at the video.
ce monde qui nous échappe, comment gagner la paix face aux nouvelles violences? Les violences changent de visage. Économique, identitaire, environnemental, sanitaire, elles dépassent et nourrissent le terrain militaire. Comme les têtes de l'hydre, on ne peut combattre l'une sans affronter les autres. La crise climatique attise la violence. La désertification au Sahel, les tensions et disputes autour de l'accès à l'eau, partout les ressources naturelles deviennent un enjeu de conflit. Les nouvelles technologies se transforment en armes. Cyberattaques, propagande, guerre hybride, l'ennemi est invisible, mais les dommages sont bien réels. Ces violences ne se limitent plus aux champs de bataille. Elles se déploient sur les réseaux, dans les villes. Elles n'opposent plus seulement des superpuissances, mais de nombreux acteurs aux intérêts apparemment inconciliables. Alors comment construire une paix durable dans un monde qui semble nous échapper? Comment trouver les réponses à ces nouvelles violences? C'est ce que nous explorerons ensemble durant ces 2 jours et dans notre web-série « Les sociétés face aux nouvelles violences ». Bienvenue au Forum mondial Normandie pour la paix 2024. Parce que la paix est l'affaire de tous.
Et vous pourrez découvrir l'intégralité.
And you can discover all these episodes of this web series on our internet website. So you need to understand the violence in this world that escapes us is the title of these plenaries in order to give us more details. And we have the professor at Sciences Po, and please welcome Bertrand Badi.
Bertrand.
Bertrand.
Mesdames, Messieurs,
ladies and gentlemen, as you can see, there's a problem. My throat is sore. It's almost impossible for me to speak to you, but there's something that's even more impossible. And what will be more impossible is not to come, because I really enjoy being here. And so I took the risk, with the risk of losing my voice, being maybe ridiculed, but I really wanted to be here in front of you. I'm sorry if I lose my voice completely during my presentation. But I wanted to share this moment of friendship with you all.
mais ça a un avantage pour
But a good thing for you is that you have to be as brief as possible. So, you know, previously it was quite easy. International violence were committed by armies against each other, states against each other. And obviously, sometimes we had someone being killed, like in Praga, the Archduke being murdered in Sarajevo. But the states were always, at one point, back in control. It means that the international violence were mobilized by states. And it may have been easy, but also had a perverse dimension to all this, because in this link between violence and the state, we managed to have a dangerous merger between state and war. War was used by states, and states needed war. They were working hand in hand, and in our culture, it's something terrible. It means that the war was at the central of the international relations, and peace was just the lack of war, the absence of war. So if we were still following this traditional theory of international relations, we could call this forum not the Forum for Peace or the Peace Forum, but rather the non-war forum. Well, something important happened. It means that the societies became more and more important, and they had a bigger impact on international relations. It means that societies led to new opportunities and new expressions used to feed the international relations and create a diversity of expressions for violence. And this is what we're seeing now. But this diversity led to a change in the behaviors of states and show the powerlessness of the states. This is truly remarkable that since 1945, the big powers never managed to lose a war because we're facing a decolonization war during the war in Vietnam, in Afghanistan, in Iraq, and in Sahel, or in the Horn of Africa. And they were facing new types of international violence, and they couldn't cope with this. So obviously, all of this started with the Second World War. I would say it was kind of a transition phase because we see many societies being important stakeholders in the international relations, like, for example, the resistance of the worst things we've seen, like genocides, mass murders. But the real history started with the decolonization war. It's normal because with a decolonization war is a state against a non-state. It's a state against a society who would like to be free. So we have brand new stakeholders. And they are, by definition, they are non-state actors. And when you are a non-state actor, well, you can no longer make a difference between what a civilian and a soldier, between one's state and non-state. So you embrace this logic, and some call resistance, and other people call terrorism. And this creation of a new type of violence is endless violence because they do not comply with the laws of war. And it doesn't comply with this concept that violence should belong to states, and states should have the monopoly of violence. And we have what we call a decentralization of violence, decentralization of how to use violence. This diversification will lead to a diversification of the ways we use violence. Since we're not a state, we're going to find the logic of violence somewhere else. It could be based on some social factors, economic factors, cultural factors, religious factors. And you shouldn't be surprised that we see that religion, culture, that the ethnicity, the clan, the tribe is now these important factors to be considered while we look at the current violence. And the result of decolonization is that most of the time we have artificial states, and we have artificial states, we have institutions that are no longer able to manage the international relations. And if these institutions cannot work properly, well, societies have to do the job themselves. And we have brand new types of violence once again, but that was just the beginning. The real change was globalization. Globalization is a fundamental change we cannot really understand, because globalization opened wide the doors of the international world and creating some great new opportunities. Thanks to globalization, all the stakeholders, 8 billion inhabitants, and I counted all of them yesterday night because I couldn't sleep. 8 billion actors now being true actors of these international relations. So they work autonomously and they want to consider their own interests. Previously, the individuals in societies wanted to consider their interest locally and then nationally, but now each and every individual has a globalized vision, and I can say that to high school students and everyone, that it's important to understand that women and men of the 21st century has a globalized vision. It means that everyone that at the core of their vision, their values, is now displayed internationally with their own resources, obviously, but with the same anger, same the rage. We need to know that at the core of these new types of violence, we have these new identities and how people identify as belonging to these values. And we see that social anger, which is no longer local or national. And you see this confusion between the pain and suffering, and it doesn't start with the state anymore. It starts with how you express violence. I still have my voice, so I'll continue. What types of violence are we talking about? I think we have to consider the typology of these new types of violence, because we need to understand who the actors are. And must consider that these types of violence are actually the product of all these actors who are no longer only the states, and each actor at the global level can produce its own type of violence. It's a multinational. He acts based on their own interests, and same as all the individual who try to see the progress for everyone. So and we should pay attention to two types of entrepreneurs. We have mafias, for example, because you know that globalization is an amazing opportunity for mafias, smugglers, drug smugglers, human traffickers. They can strengthen their organizations at the global level. And another type of actors, these new private militias, new private armies, all these war leaders who don't belong to any army. They have no interest in seeing peace and the end of hostilities. And what will happen to the militias? What will happen to the warlords if the war is finally over? Well, he'll be completely unemployed. And I would say it's a brand new aspect of these new human relations. It's how we can keep on reproducing war and violence. And we also have the slings, and because these mafias, they need this complicity because they need to have a pact with political actors. Could be states, could be rebels. Can actually share the burden, because a gangster is always good to take hostages and then sell them to political actors. And the second type of violence is what I would call the social violence, caused by this shift in the context. And I would like to insist more on one type of social violence, which is truly worrying. This chaotic urbanization. When Asia got urbanized, and during the first stage of urbanization, each individual had a GDP approximately of $5,000. But when Africa is getting urbanized, the individuals don't even have $1,000 of GDP. What does it mean? Well, they cannot find their right place in urban areas. What does it mean? They need to have this urban violence so they actually find their place in these urban areas. Let's look at Kulunas in Kinshasa, because we know that young people there, they know that in order to have a nice job, they wake up in the morning, they have a nice job. What does it mean? Well, they take a knife and they walk around in the city, so they can actually, there's additional resources for them. It creates some kind of endemic violence. No one can cope with this, and creates social inequalities, gender inequalities. Let's not forget that the Second War in Congo since 1998 we registered 200,000 rapes just in Congo. And it's just another example of that we see, because no one mentioned this on TV, on French TV, la trivialization of this, and also the ecology is also extremely important. They link to mentalization. And finally, how can we not insist on the third type of violence? It has to do with systemic violence, and based on the way people work, the way people live on the planet. I remind you that millions of people die every year, and because of climate change, more than 5 to 10 million people die, and health crisis cause between 8 to 15 million deaths every year, and no one cares. But if you look at the number of people killed during conflicts and everything, all these people who died because of our indifference and the fact that we benefit from our inaction. And this is also a type of violence. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'll have to stop now. I think my friends are telling me, and my throat is losing its voice. And so once again, we're facing some important mutations, because we moved from a time where international violence was per se international, but now international violence is a violence per destination. It means that everything and almost anything can create violence and can adapt to the violence that already exists. And the states are even more powerless. And what happens to a state, and what do a powerless state does? Well, it just becomes more and more indifferent, and once again the new face of diplomacy of indifference. That's it, ladies and gentlemen. This is what I wanted to do. I'm happy to see that I managed to finish my presentation. Thank you.
Tu t'installes ici. Merci.
Thank you very much, dear Bertrand. Please sit here, because you'll stay with us throughout the plenary session. And we have the first panel, and we have to do with the radiography of violence. And we have a paleontologist and a head of research at GCA. She chaired a working group of the GIC, and is considered to be one of the 100 most important people according to the Time magazine. Please welcome Valérie Masson-delmotte, who was born in Port-au-Prince. He's a geography teacher at La Sorbonne at the University of Haiti. We have Jean-Marie Théodard. She's the expert on human rights, and she's the reporter for the special rapporteur of the United Nations on extraditions. And she just arrived this morning from New York. And please welcome Agnès Caramar. He's an expert on everything related to development, and is the economist-in-chief at the French AFD. He's the executive director of innovation, strategy and research. Please welcome Thomas Melot-Niot.
Merci à tous d'être avec nous.
Thank you all for being with us this morning. So let's start, without further ado, with you, Valérie Masson-delmotte, because we know that this topic interests us all. It has to do with the climate. You're a scientist. You were the co-chair of a GIEC working group, and you spent many years to talk about the effect of climate change on conflicts, but also social conflicts and armed conflicts. Which link do you see between climate and our safety of our homes, of safety in terms of water and everything? Okay, let me go back in time. So let's go back to, we are 2024, and let's go back to 2014. We still don't have the Paris Agreement on climate. We still don't have an action strategy to adapt to a changing climate. We don't have these solidarity mechanisms for the one most heavily impacted by climate change. We don't have a collective strategy to reduce our CO2 emissions. We don't even have a shared goals. But in 2024 now we have the Paris Treaty, Paris Agreement. We also have a common strategy, and the latest version of the latest report by GIEC highlighted how serious the situation is, because we see very heavy impacts all around the world, and it shows that it's urgent to change the scale on the way we work, on the consequences and the causes of global warming. It also highlighted that we can act. We can divide by 2 the CO2 emissions in the next 10 years. And we know the decade is critical. We know what we can do. We know we have the knowledge, but as a scientist and a climate scientist, we see that we have these opportunities. How human lives influence and impact climate change, because we know that global warming has been anticipated, was this forecast, and we didn't act enough. And now we have to face the consequences that keep on worsening. We see that we have a 1.3 degrees expected in the future, and we see that we did more than we thought, that we have the massive fires in Canada, and they emitted more CO2 than India. And see the importance of the ecosystems. They are struggling to cope with climate change. We have corals, they are whitening, and even though corals have a very important role to play. So how do we see that? What are the consequences? See that serious heat waves having a massive impact on the lives of elderly people, even though in spite of all the strategies. And we'll have massive rains, and we see we have more severe damage, and we see a large number of people displaced because of climate change, including in France. And we see the severe droughts, and because rain don't fall on these areas, and we see that it's a vector, the vector of climatic injustice, and will have a serious impact on the safety of our homes, on the water supply. Will have an impact in terms of agriculture for the farmers, and we have a most severe impact in poorer areas. And we have students coming from Saint-Pierre-et-Miquelon, and we see that the sea levels are rising, and it has an impact on more than 1.3 billion people. And we just started to see the first impacts on the rising sea levels, and it creates new challenges. How we can reinforce these buildings, and because the risk of having a bad adaptation, because we need to consider the precipitations, and so it creates new causes for conflicts. potential conflicts. And you have major risks. We have to consider all the ecosystems, the fisheries, so we have the necessary nutrients and proteins, the livelihood of the farmers. And we have new disease vectors having an impact on cattle, and because we have new diseases appearing. And we need to study the livelihoods of the farmers and pretty much of everyone, because we see that soil is struggling. The impact on floatable areas, and once again we go back to the safety of our homes. And we have 3.5 billion people struggling, and currently what we call vulnerable areas, and we call the hot spots, because these hot spots are facing several challenges caused by climate change and global warming. And we're also facing economic risks. How we can insure our homes. It's no longer possible to get an insurance because of for the physical risks. What happens when you can no longer have this insurance against these risks? But it becomes a risk.
And that is the last point on which I want to finish. We're talking about a group of risk, vital risk: health, water, food, security of your homes. The action regarding the climate is a challenge of protection over the long term, and it's also a challenge of justice, of social justice. Compared to the responsibilities that we have, it's our greenhouse gases that are influencing the planetary climate, different historical responsibilities, different capacities of acting. And on the consequences of climate change, it's also challenges of justice between territories. And since there are many young people here today, it's also a challenge of justice between generations. Delaying a resolute action for climate, it's pushing it towards the other people, towards a far more brutal action, more intense actions, and to face far more hard consequences in the future. So the challenges of climate change are really completely turning on their heads. So the entire world organization, all our actions are affecting the climate planet, and the climate planet is affecting the conditions of life on the world. It's an existential issue. Give her a hand. That was what you just said is extremely strong worded. I am going to ask Bertrand Bartry, who asked for a reaction. When you listen to it, completely echoes what you said, Bertrand, early on, because when you speak about security, food security, health challenges, we can see that the climate change is causing considerable effects. And that's why we do the link with the construction of peace. Before I ask the question, Bertrand, yes, very quickly. I think it is very important, and I'm thinking about our friends, students and high schoolers here. We can see that, more and more, there's two levels of peace coming up. There's the classical peace that is non-war state, and there's the human peace. And what is really interesting is that the climate insecurity, just like all insecurities, kills twice. It kills in itself, through what you have just said. It also kills by becoming the first factor of the new, the deciding factor of the new wars. We can't understand the war in the Sahel without understanding that the growing desert by 10 centimeters per hour. I don't know if you realize what that means, 10 centimeters per hour. There's two pieces. There is the non-war, that is a minority war, that is the human peace. So, as you said, 10 years ago there was no framework. Now there is a framework, but nevertheless, the answers that are provided today are very far from meeting the challenges. And we're talking also about social justice and equality. We see the war, we're facing the war, we know that we need to act, and we do not act, and we even see ways of avoiding the actual obstacle, saying, or maybe we can adapt, or we can live with it, maybe science or technology can help us to overcome this. When we work together on this roundtable, we used an image, the image of end-of-life care. What did you want to say? Well, regarding climate risks, the classical responses is to act on the causes, reduce the greenhouse gases, so 80% is linked to fossil energy. This is a very clear message coming out of stop using fossil fuels, coal, all the while ensuring a decarbonated electricity supply, allowing everyone to live decently, particularly in the areas where you have no access to energy. And the second big vector, it's the food system, 1/3 of the greenhouse gas emissions around the world, with the challenges of resilience and multiple challenges. Second point, acting on consequences, risk management, solidarity, adaptability. These are the classical responses. But we also see other actors coming up with technological solutions, which are last recourse solutions, instead of transforming our practices to preserve the environment that we need locally and planetarily, climate, biodiversity, resources. They say, let's change the environment, geoengineering, manipulate the climate, or intervening at large scale in some regions. And this in itself makes new image. This is end of life. We know we only try to hide the symptoms. We only do not try to change anything, just like when someone is not curable anymore. And this generates new risks, and new risks particularly in the conflicts. But the responses that we're providing, they are in themselves source of risks. We have numerous economical actors and political actors that want to basically feed into the denial, the status quo, to preserve their interests. And this also feeds into the disinformation, climate skeptics, denying the severity of the situation, the human influence on the climate, the relevance of the scientific research, the importance of the impact, that you can't do that anymore. So now it comes into new forms that are aiming particularly since the invasion of Ukraine, is basically attacking the democratic process in Europe by polarizing the public opinion on all the levels of action. The collective capacity to deliberate together in order to build the strategy of response by acting on the causes and the consequences. So this misinformation, this growing populism, this is a vector of conflict. Political inertia, economic or social inertia, actions of at very small scales, largely insufficient. All this feeds into social demand of more radical action. Behind that, you have the danger associated with the threats to liberty, freedom of expression or attacking climate defenders. Everything that on the non-violent attacks. So climate actions, they also can be badly designed, badly implemented, for instance, when it makes the cost of energy higher, and then people are feeling unjust because they spend so much on, which we've seen during the Yellow Jackets crisis, or the climate action that are going to attack the industrial competitivity. All this provokes tensions, generates tensions. So how can we take that into account, these vulnerabilities, by building together transitions that would be fair and conceived as being fair? This is really participatory challenges. Action for climate can also lead to land grabbing, agricultural land farming, or ecosystems for carbon pits, for production, for biomass, for energy, or for carbon storage. And the risk of land grabbing where the land tenure is fragile. So we're going to shift the issue away into other countries. And climate action, they can be efficient, but it can also be extremely unfair. It can increase some social vulnerabilities or lock down practices that will have to change by building the common walls, or the future crisis. We have examples in France on the water management or on the coastal management of these challenges linked to a bad adaptation. So the risk is not just geoengineering and bad governance based on private actors who have spatial technologies, not just states. This governance doesn't exist. So it's also the building of a democratic framework, an inclusive framework, a participative framework on the climate policies. And that is extremely important. That is why I'm mentioning it. It's because in France, all strategic documents energy program, the low carbon economy, the biomass strategies, the national adaptation plan. It's really a challenge of ownership, of democratic ownership on the basis of the scientific elements, factual scientific elements that are fundamental for democratic climate action and that will not be a source of conflict. Thank you, Valérie Masson-delmotte. Thanks to you, we are now really in the core of the subject. I can see the dialectic between security and vulnerability. And now I turn towards you, Thomas Meloniot, because answering this vulnerability, that is your work at the French Agency for Development. You also need to adapt to the evolution of international context and the nature of these new violences. FDI has actually created an investment fund. It represents about 125,000 million euros per year for projects contributing to prevention and the response to violent conflicts. Can you tell us what particularity of this investment? Yes, first of all, thank you and congratulations to the region.
Je suis déjà un petit peu stressé parce que quand j'entends l'ensemble des menaces qui ont été décrites et bien décrites par les uns.
This was very well described, all the challenges. It can create a feeling of fear, of discouragement, or indifference, as Per Normandy said. But I think that President Hervé Morin was very clear when he encourages to identify solutions. I'm going to position myself on this, as you said, regarding prevention and the treatment in order to have end-of-life care that leads to the death of the patients and not to the actual healing of the patients. Regarding prevention, I would say, particularly in the link with climate change, it brings us, and it can be surprising for the youth listening to us, at times also acting for solidarity and also in our own interest in the emerging countries in order to reduce carbon emissions, because this is where most of the carbon greenhouse gas emission increases are concentrating. At the moment, we underestimate the weight of the new emerging countries, but that is where a lot of the future of the humanity in terms of greenhouse gases is going to be played out. I'm not going to come back to that because this is not the issue today. The second thing regarding the treatment, the actual treatment, or when the crises are already undergoing, that is the reason in the most acute areas. That's why we've created, together with the Minca Fund, with the support of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. This is where we want to intervene in the areas where the conflicts are most acute: Middle East, Sahel region, Lake Chad, Central Africa. This is where the conflicts are already hot and burning. And what we could fund in order to adapt our methods, our procedures, in order to act faster, including in areas, or like Per Normandy said, where the states already have lost the control of the situation. This was the case in the Sahel region, for instance, where the main countries of the Sahel region had lost control over their own territory. Same in Central Africa, where the countries had been pushed, or in Palestine, for instance, some states, there's a loss of control over the authorities, and so that we cannot rely on these actors anymore. So we support very concrete projects in order to reduce the conflictuality in areas that regularly produce violence. It was mentioned in Sahel region, lots of conflicts between cattle breeders, between farmers on the availability in grazing areas and water resources. And we can work on these type of conflicts that are partly linked to human pressure, to climate change. They can also have political and ethnic dimensions. We're going to try to build together with actors in the Sahel region, in Central Africa and the Near East, on specific issues with an interaction between a global threat and also a more local approach. So we are on a very rapid action. It's not a emergency situation. We're not working in refugee camps. We want to reduce the probability or the intensity of a conflict, and which maybe we can develop some example, but it's true that it's very often through the access to water, to safeguarding the land tenure, which is a classical conflict source. That's the first category, and indeed on which we mobilize money, mainly under, we can do credits, but we'll mainly do subsidies in the countries that are less advanced or in crisis, because in this situation we do not try to have a specific economical interest. We want to preserve the peace and the limitation of conflict. Maybe one last point, and I'm going out of the Minca, and I want to go back on what Valérie Masson-delmotte said on the conflicts that can be linked to transitions. We don't necessarily see it like this, but leaving the fossil fuels in an emerging country, an important energy tax, that can be a source of a social conflict. And we often see the development as building new capacities and the energy, developing renewable energy, and of course it's part of it, but more and more what we're seeing is that transition can be a technological topic, but can also be a request for we need to work with different actors, with regions, and to limit, to planify, and have a orientation work. These territories that are facing this transition, we spoke lots of conflicts, violent conflicts, interstate, new risks, but the transition in itself is also a topic that needs to be dealt with. And further down, what you said, we also see the brutality of some evolutions. We've seen what happens at the moment on the African continent, where France is not welcome anymore in many countries, where the French agency had actions and initiatives, and we can also see the effects of climate change that led to vulnerability in areas where they did not exist before. This evolution and the brutality of this evolution has led you at the French Agency for Development to revise the geographical scope of your interventions. In 2 words, yes. And then longer, the French Development Agency were a public agency, so when the French diplomacy takes positions, then we are aligned with this position. In the Sahel region, regarding the strong political tensions with the Mali government, we stopped working in this area. It's kind of slightly different in Burkina Faso or Niger, where we've been able to maintain the subsidies. In Mali, this type of cooperation was also forbidden. So there's a difference between the 3 countries. Yes, generally, when there's a strong political tension between 2 states, then it has consequences in the area of development. In some cases, we can maintain the actions via the private sector and civil society, but in other cases, any corporation's action will be forbidden. I would like to nuance slightly more. I wouldn't say that France is being kicked out of Africa. We have a post-colonial context that is stronger in some francophone African countries. It's not all of them, but it's true in some of them. But what we're seeing is that other countries with which we had less intense relations are now coming to see us. They want to have a more political cooperation, expertise in the field of energy and transport. The activity of AFD in countries like Southern Africa, Nigeria, Kenya are very dynamic, even though, as in other countries, our action has been more reduced. I think it is very important in the globalization is to have adaptive strategies, because political crisis can happen. We can have major ideological difference, but that doesn't mean that the development action will continue at the benefit of the populations. The states are always very important, but in some cases you can have relationships with local authorities, private sector, civil society, that allows you to have a link with the society. Of course, at a certain degree of political crisis, we completely stop doing. But I wanted to introduce this nuance. Thank you, Thomas Meloniot. Bertrand, just one sentence, because I can't say anything more. It is fundamental to understand that peace today continues to depend from the states and more of the social behaviors. It's in the learning of new behaviors that will be able to build peace. So this is very important. That was not the case before, and that is a pathway to hope. Thomas Meloniot, yes, one last word. Of course, we deal with huge problems. You can't tackle them alone. We need to build coalitions. We've seen it with the climate, with COP21. In our area, we work with other financial actors regarding common financing mechanisms in order to have a wider scope as what we could have together. Of course, the other option is to build a coalition in order to have results that are at the level of, at the scope of the challenges we know. Yeah, we are running out of time. I would like to ask a subsidiary question to Valérie Masson-delmotte. Please be very short. This invisible corner of the indirect impact on the climate of armed conflict and militarization. Yes, armed conflict, as it's a failure. It's a failure of what a sustainable development is. And so we have this double challenge of building the conditions of peace that would be resilient in a changing climate, for which the greenhouse gas reduction is important, with sustainable management of resources, taking into account the sources of conflict, potential conflict, social conflicts, and the building of a sustainable peace, and also goes by the axis of clean water, reducing food insecurity, and also takes into account in the mobility issue, because immobility and locking people down is a factor of vulnerability in many contexts. So this challenge is important. And the wars are different. The wars is the increase of military spending that are going to take away from the development budgets to investing in decarbonization, in risk management. In 2023, we had a 3.7 increase of military spending in the world. We haven't got any framework for the reporting on greenhouse gases linked to military entering the war. It's confidential, so even harder. The wars have a direct greenhouse gas emission via logistic action, indirect via the destruction of ecosystems, the loss of carbon pits, and the reconstruction costs and impacts. All this takes away from the energy strategies, the benefits of the international companies. They have exploded with the increase of the energy prices. This, of course, goes directly against the transition. The energy security has led to long-term contracts that are going to lock us into greenhouse gas emissions. They are also accelerated decarbonization. We have realized how vulnerable we are, tragically vulnerable we are, from supply sources from countries that do not share the will to build democracy, peace, and preserve human rights. Wars make cooperation for climate impossible. I mean, the Arctic Council that has completely stopped functioning because of the tension with Russia. And of course, the wars are increasing massively the vulnerability via the destruction of vulnerability, by polluting water tables, the air, the ground, and by increasing poverty. So when we have extreme climate events in areas that had known military conflict, and the example I would give is in Libya, for instance, where the government is completely split up and the management of the crisis in itself, the emergency management of the rebuilding, it's even harder. We can see how all this is important, all these are combinations that are diabolic. So Agnès Calamard, now you are the General Secretary of Amnesty International. So this violence that we've been speaking since the beginning of the morning, it completely changes the situation. We are living through a change, that everything's going faster than ever. Amnesty International is acting against the violences impacting human rights. For you, what's new? It's not just the violence in itself, but the convergence of violence. Can you explain us that? Yes, thank you very much. I'm very happy to be able to join you here. We live in a world that's changing radically, that is characterized by threats and challenges that are overlapping and mixing each other. I would question the idea of new violences. I don't think it's a new violence. What I can see is that we are in a time of great instability on the scale of human history, and this instability comes from the fact that we have systemic forces that have joined, and one of them, the oldest of them, of these forces, is climate change. That is picking up speed with huge implications on the human societies. The second one is the transformation of the economical system and of the capitalist system. The capitalism needs to renew every 200-300 years, so there's a new industrial revolution that is the engine of this change in capitalism. It's a big source of instability. It's also a big source of inequality. Since 2007, 2008, ever since the last financial crisis, the inequalities within the states and between the states have grown more intense, and these inequalities are a huge source of violence. I think you mentioned it earlier. There is a world economy that delivers a huge riches to a very small number, and unemployment and misery to billions of people. One example of what's going on is the world is not able to reach its sustainable development objectives. I just came back from New York, where it's one of the topics that is worrying most the international community, the deficit of financing of these sustainable development objectives goals is estimated at $3 billion per year. And if this deficit is not abounded, then the inequalities will only grow. I would just wanted to give you another example of these inequalities. The five biggest billionaires on the planet, they have doubled their assets over the last 2 years, while the 5 billion poorest people have become even poorer. Those who are responsible of 1%, the 1% of the richest people, the 1% of the richest people in the world, they are responsible for twice as much emissions than half of the entire world population. Yeah, greenhouse gas emissions. So that gives you an idea of the growing inequality, and this inequality is a form of violence, of course, and a source of violence. The last of the Industrial Revolution, that was the engine of this transformation of the capitalist system, centered on information technologies and on AI. They're transforming all of our societies. It's going to transform, that means what it means to be human, and it's going to continue to increase the divisions and the inequalities between the states. So this is already two historical strengths: climate and the transformation of the system and transformation of the capitalist system. And there's a third one, that is the transformation of the international political system. The Bretton Woods model, the model created at the end of World War II, the system is being destroyed, dismantled. The superpowers, China, the US, and Russia, have more or less declared that the system is obsolete, does not meet their interest anymore. And so, using different techniques and tax strategies, each of these superpowers tries to transform it to its advantage so that it meets the hegemonic model they want to implement. So this is also characterized by huge instability, a new arms race, a new commercial war, and a new form of colonization next to the old model of colonization, and new colonization, like colonization of space or of the Arctic regions, the ocean floors, also the multiplication of sovereignty conflicts, proxy conflict, hot zones, and the multiplication of the new international conflicts. For 20 years, we didn't have an international conflict between states, and since 2-3 years, sadly, we're seeing more and more of them, and we are in the middle of 2 of them, but there's others happening right now. Another factor of this questioning of the system, of the dismantling of the system that's installed at the end of World War II, is that international law is being restricted at the normative level. All the rules that had been implemented after World War II are not now adequate anymore for a number of reasons. But particularly the superpowers do not agree with them, so they are attacking the idea of universal norms, universal standards, and even human rights in particular, while the dismantling of the multilateralism of after World War II is organized. On the specific point, you mentioned all these violences. The new aspect is that they are converging, and this can generate a form of a chain reaction. We can see this, the question we can ask ourselves, how can we stop this runoff? And you fight against the double standard. Can you explain to us what you mean by double standards? You're speaking about the normative response of the response of the actor, particularly of the states that do not necessarily take their responsibility, that provokes this running off of these mechanisms. Yes, but I would like to suggest that this double standard are violences. They are violences. There's no doubt about this. They are not generating violence. They are violence in themselves. So what do we call by double standard? It's not new. It's the interests that are predominating are geostrategic interests, economical interests, national security interests, strategic interests. So we're going to support your friends, or at least the enemies of your enemies, and you're going to not be consistent, even if when your friends commit the most horrible crimes, we continue to support them because they are our friends. And all these are that's the double standard that that everyone is using. The United States, China, Russia, nobody has the monopoly of the double standard. What I would like to insist on is that we have entered in an era that is far more dangerous than the double standard. Within the double standard, we had a tendency to say, okay, there are some rules that prevail. We apply them by discriminating among them. But actually, there is really a practice and an opinion that consists in saying there are no more rules, everything goes. These rules are not adapted to the world in which we live, or even worse, they are not adapted to myself. So we see this as Russia and its aggression against Ukraine, and try to justify this aggression. We can see it actually with the way Israel has committed huge crimes against the population in Palestine in the name of its own inner security. So the rules of international law that require that you do not commit indiscriminate attacks against civilian population, Israel say these rules do not apply to me because I have a security issue. That is the discourse which you find pretty much everywhere. And the United States, by providing a support to Israel within the UN Security Council, basically validates the strategy. This narrative consistent of saying, and these actions consistent in saying, there's no more rules. The rules can only apply when I think that they are applicable. They're not applicable in issues of security, of national security, or terrorism. And I would like to quote this very expression that Mr. Badi said, where he said that for some we're talking about terrorism, for others we speak about resistance, and I think it is very important to be lucid about this. And I wanted to add a third dimension to this violence. It's racism. We haven't mentioned it a lot, but I would put it on the table for us at Amnesty International. There is really a form of racism that seems to us to be the driver of some or many of practices at international level. Biopolitic at world level, we've seen it during the COVID, continue seeing at the actual when we see that the price of the life of a Palestinian child does not have the same value as the life of an Israeli child. That is a form of racism. We privileged people, white-skinned Western people, we have a tendency of pushing this aside, but I can assure you that for the majority of the rest of the world, racism is part of these violences, systemic violences, which we need to face.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Agnes Kalamar, for these powerful words, because you mentioned a world with no longer rules, and there's a small territories where there's no more rules, and we haven't seen any rules for quite a long time. We wanted to invite you, Mr. Theodore, in order to highlight the very small-sized country in the Caribbean Sea, and I'm talking about Haiti, and you defend a very interesting theory. I think that what's happening in Haiti could be the future of the world. What do you mean by that? Thank you very much. First and foremost, I would like to pay tribute to the youth here, coming from many different countries, here to share something with us. Is it better? Can you hear me well? Once again, I would like to pay tribute to these young people coming from various countries and regions, and they may be worried because we're talking about very serious topics. I would like to thank the organizers of this round table. And most specifically, I would like to thank Mr. Badi, who's a model for me, an inspiration for me. What I wanted to say now, during this discussion, everything has already been said, and I just arrived maybe not too late, but right on time. Arrived right on time to tell you that everything has been said. I would like to translate it into Haitian Creole, because it's exactly what's happening, because Haiti was and still is what would be like a prophetic state for the future of the world, because we talk about a disaster, a climatic disaster, and the geograph Jared Diamond mentioned, like, Haiti, that it's a collapse. Just mentioned that when Christopher Columbus arrived in 1492, 90% of the country was covered with forests, and just is shrinking constantly, and we considered barely 3% of the whole territory can consider to be preserved with forests. We talk about systemic violence and having an impact on human rights and this very concept of dignity and human dignity. We also mentioned the elevation of countries becoming dead angles because the geopolitics disregard what they have to say. And the President, Hervé Morin, quoted Elie Wiesel and talked about our history in common and the risk of being indifferent. And it's right in line with what we're seeing in Haiti. Just bring some nuance, because Haiti is not that small. Even if you consider maybe Normandy with its 29,000 square kilometers to be a small region, and maybe consider to be quite insulting, to be honest. But we have probably a surface area of 27,000 square kilometers. We have 12 million inhabitants in Haiti compared to 3 million inhabitants in Normandy. We are 400 inhabitants per square kilometers, and the density is much higher than the density of France. And We understood that it's a burden, demographic burden. It's a ticking bomb, and it is one of the main characteristics of my country, Haiti. Haiti, is it a prophetic country? Because we've already been so in the past. For those of you who do not know much about the history of Haiti, Haiti fought for its independence in 1804, and it took 11 years of independence war to get our independence. And the victory was the victory of Verge. And the 1st January of 1804, Haiti became the first black state in the New World. And I would say that Haiti was not the daughter of the French Revolution, because you always mention that we have 4 revolutions: the English Revolution, the American Revolution, and the French Revolution, and finally the Haitian Revolution. I think we should see it the other way. I think the revolution started in Haiti. The problem with the Age of Enlightenment and this concept of freedom wouldn't have been possible without this enraged fight in this new world with the bookmal and everyone. This idea that we need to live free or die would become a universal principle. We thought that after the edict of 1685, we called the Black Code, consider that the skin color could be an essential characteristic of man. We don't have to go back to ancient Greece, but when we talk about slavery, sometimes we get the feeling that slaves are like some kind of ethnicity were brought to Haiti and they have to submit to the voice of their masters. It's quite the opposite. They're free men brought from Africa, and they remain free, but they have this prophetic function of telling the world that freedom is universal, and that the philosophers understood when they looked at the New World, because we have the recurring revolts and protests. These anonymous fighters, including women who got raped by their masters, and they preferred having an abortion. And it's quite terrible. They make the children disappear so they wouldn't have to be slaves. By becoming the first free black country in the world, Aimé Césaire said that his concept of negritude became reality with Henri Christophe, and we used the human rights to make them a universal principle. But now when we look at the news, we can no longer be proud of being a free and sovereign country as promised by our revolution. But now, and Haiti appears like a cosmic system, like a black hole, leading to a systemic collapse of the country. Yes, but Jean-Marie Théodat, we have in 1995 we have a clear disruption because the president Aristide decided to end army, and then we have the end of the monopoly of legitimate violence. And if the state can no longer use violence, then violence became widespread. And you mentioned this black hole, the cosmic black hole we have now. We have smugglers, we have mafias, gangsters, and all of this is connected to the rest of the world. But in order to see this violence, we need to have accomplices, and we have people benefiting from this. Yes, I mentioned this cosmic metaphor of a black hole, but we could also say that if we rescale and we have another point of view, we can have like a patchwork and like entangled strings. And if you pull one string, you can see pretty much all the topics: environment, safety, politics, And obviously the state powers. And as you said, the state lost the monopoly of legitimate violence, as you said, because in 1995 the president decided to end the army, and because the army was responsible for many crimes, and it was a terrible idea, to be honest, because now the violence is in the hands of gangsters, and Haiti has become like a trap, a black hole of crime, and we consider that 25% of cocaine coming to the United States is passing through Haiti. So it means that we have non-state actors, what we call the drug cartels, and have the weapons and have the financial means that much more important than the resources of a small Haiti. And remind you that Haiti is considered to be the poorest country in the area, but we have drug cartels and give dozens of millions of euros and dollars. It's easy to corrupt the president of the republic, president of the Senate, of the parliament, and this systemic corruption is threatening the whole world. And I want to tell you that Haiti could be the prophet of the future, because, as I mentioned, we are all the examples currently happening in Haiti. Thank you very much, Mr. Theodore, for your testimony. I would like to add something to what you said about Normandy, because Normandy is small. They also conquered a country and also gave a king to the English. So you can be small but powerful. Fantastic first round table. And I will tell you that at 12:30 you actually sign your books in our bookshop. And Valérie de Masson, your book is called Face au changement climatique, Facing Climate Change. Thank you. A round of applause for our guests.
Venez nous rejoindre, Bertrand.
Voilà. On va demander à Bertrand Badi de rester.
We'll ask Bertrand Badi to stay with us for a few minutes. And let's see if Bertrand still a few words to say, can still speak. Before we move on to the second roundtable of this morning session, we wanted to, Frederick and I would like to suggest a good read, because you're probably familiar with Sun Tzu, the very famous Chinese general, and you also know Machiavelli, and you consider that he'll be a theoretician of war. What about to create? Would it be interesting to create a theory of war? And you wrote a book called The Art of Peace, and will be released in a few days, published by Flammarion. Dear Bertrand, what do you mean by the art of peace? It sounds extremely interesting. In a few words, could you give us a pitch of what's in your book? Just imagine that in March, the Flammarion publisher said that our bestseller is called The Art of War by Sun Tzu. And it would be a good moment to write something called The Art of Peace. And I just literally fell off my chair. And I said that behind this very interesting title, there's a real question. Why do we have hundreds of books on war and almost nothing on peace? And my challenge is quite pretty much in line with my age. I have nothing else to lose at my age. So behind this question, I try to bring two humble answers. The first one is to say that war in our history happened before peace. And I already mentioned the intimate relationship between war and peace, And the fact that we defined peace as non-war. And the second reason is that we need to conquer a new field of peace. This new field of peace brings us back to the human soul, what Victor Hugo called a sympathy of souls. The fact that we can think peace as something completely different from war, and we consider peace to be the pinnacle of humanity. So I suggested 9 recipes. It's like a cookbook, but I have nine recipes to build peace. To be about redefine peace, then to have a human peace, a global peace, a systemic peace, institutionalized peace, and a diplomatic peace. And the two most important elements for me, that sympathetic peace, because whatever we say, the migrants is the future of humanity. And educated peace, because our education prepares us for war. Since high school we talk about the knights in shining armors, we talk about the King Louis XIV, and we never talk about the Saint-Pierre Bay and very famous people. We never talk about Léon Bourgeois, and who inspired Wilson, and to talk about multilateralism, and everything's based on the education system. Can give him a round of applause. Thank you.
Vous allez pouvoir regagner votre place. Vous signerez votre livre dès cet après-midi.
You will sign your book this afternoon at the bookshop. And we can move on to the second roundtable. And powerlessness against violence, to deal with violence. And we have transitional violence, global violence, and social violence. We wonder if we are powerless in fighting this violence. Are we condemned to submit to violence? In order to answer this question, please welcome Eric Danan. He is a diplomat and a former ambassador of France in Israel. I would like you to welcome Hervé Moritz. He's a university teacher in Pretoria. He's a former director of the Center for Conflict Resolutions. Is Adekeye Adebajo. Please welcome Joseph Maila. He's a professor for geopolitics and international mediation at the ESSEC Business School in Paris.
Il n'y a que des mecs. Voilà, installez-vous, Joseph.
Please take your seats. Once again, we're running late. So we have to be very sharp and as concise as possible. Okay. Just putting you a bit of pressure on your shoulders. A lot of people are moving around. Let me start with you, Eric Danan. Eric Danan, you're a former ambassador of France in Israel until June 2023, just a few days after you've left. It happened on the 7th of October. You have a war between Hamas and Israel. There's no correlation whatsoever between me leaving Israel and a war happening. But nothing seems to stop this violence in this area. According to you, will we have a sustainable solution to this war, or should we expect a never-ending conflict in this region? Thank you and very much for your invitation. Good morning, everyone. I thought I would start with a very long introduction to answer your question because it's a very complex question, but I'll try to be as brief as possible. The war will continue. Yes, the war will go on. It will go on because both protagonists want it to continue. And why do they want it to go on? Because they haven't reached their goals, the war goals, yet. We could remind all you of these goals because from the Israeli side, they want to destroy Hamas as much as possible, bring the hostages back, make sure that Gaza is a non-aggressive territory after the war. And they added recently a fourth objective is because they make sure that displaced Israelis displaced because of Hezbollah can go back to their homes. And on the other side, they haven't reached the targets, except for one. Hamas wanted to kill as many people as possible. And the biggest anti-Semitic massacre since Shoah. And we wanted to take as many hostages as possible so it can be exchanged with prisoners. And I don't think this is going to happen. And finally, Hamas wanted to sit at the negotiation table for the day after the war. And I'm not sure this is going to happen. Hamas has been destroyed, militarily speaking, at probably 80%. They've lost the military war, or it's about to war the military war. But they won the war in the media by catching Israel in a trap, pretty much with the trap with Daesh because of the reprisals, the way the guerrilla of Israel completely collapsed in the media. So they won the military war, but they've lost the media war. For Hezbollah, it could end very quickly. We can have a truce, and because Hezbollah always said that they would bomb Israel to support Hamas. So as soon as it stops with Hamas, it will stop with Hezbollah too. This being said, we have to consider all the factors. We have the presidential elections in the US, etc. But I give you more generic elements about why this conflict takes so much time and still going on as we because since 1948 we have two important elements which led the conflict to be impossible to solve. I'll give you three main examples. The first one, what's necessary for peace in the recognition of actors of both parties. This being said, because it's an Arab-Israeli conflict focused on Palestine. Some Arab states refuse to recognize the existence of Israel. Algeria, Libya, Lebanon, they refuse to acknowledge the existence of Israel. For example, have a look at Lebanon. They refuse to acknowledge the existence of Israel. And when we refuse to recognize the other party, it's impossible to do the same thing. The same for Palestine. The Israeli side, they refused to recognize the Palestinian state. So the first is quite difficult to achieve peace when you refuse to recognize that the other party exists. The second thing is that while we see the failure of having political solutions, we see that radicalization of the religious aspect of this conflict. And we know that religious radicalism is a complete opposition to the political solutions. We have Hamas, Hezbollah. They are very religious and very violent jihadist organizations. On the other side, in Israel, we see the rise of the most religious and violent and radical tendencies. It's not random if you see that so many people are just being more and more radical, and you see the most radical aspect of both parties, and we know that religious radicalism is the venom inside this. Although it destroys these religions, because you see that Islamism is the worst enemy of Islam and ultra-orthodoxy is the worst enemy of Judaism. As Bertrand Badi said, and I like to quote him, because I try to replace him because he's lost his voice. Something that happened in the last 10 to 15 years, and he demonstrated this very well, because the image of a Palestinian has changed drastically in the last 10 to 15 years, and the absolute evil is no longer Shoah. We no longer protect Jews from anti-Semitism. It's no longer the First World War or the Second World War. The absolute evil for many of you is colonialism. And if this absolute evil is now colonialism, well, Europe and the West and Israel are accused of being colonialists because the West has become wealthy thanks to these 4 centuries to 5 centuries of colonialism. So the Palestinian, who used to be the essence, the symbol of local resistance, someone who wanted to get this country back, and now there's become a general symbol for resistance against globalization, which is considered to be some kind of westernization of the world, and it has changed drastically. And since we no longer have anyone to be the symbol of this evolution, because previously we have T-shirts with Che Guevara of Keffieh on your shoulders. No one can consider to be Mahmoud Abbas to be a symbol of anything, and now the Palestinian flag has become a symbol of resistance against the West. And so we use it pretty much everywhere. Just like in France, for example, you will see Palestinian flags, the protests against the pension reform during a football match, but also to filter some rooms at some universities. So you see that how to fight against this, to fight for peace in the Middle East is getting even more trickier, because you have the symbol of Palestine and Palestinians pretty much appearing pretty much everywhere, like a symbol of resistance against the West.
And this is part of the Global South approach. So for the students here, this Global South is a number of countries that have nothing in common geographically, economically, social, but they have a common claim, being able to write their own history and ensuring that it's not the West alone writing the story. So the Palestinian flag becomes one of the banners of this Global South approach. So a quick word to finish on the resistance and terrorism. This is fundamental because the distinction, because resisting or terrorism is a political appreciation of an action. An action of extreme violence, but whether you consider it politically in a certain way or another, you are consider his author to be a resistor, a resistance fighter, or a terrorist. How do we choose if the person that committed this act is a resistor or a terrorist? It's a history that judges. A resistor, a resistance fighter is a terrorist who won, and a terrorist is a resistance fighter who lost. Of course, that seems to be a simplistic expression, but it explains to why the UN cannot define, stay in a stable way, what is terrorism, because the international judge will never be able to say if politically this act is an act of resistance or an act of terrorism, and therefore it adds to the Middle East turmoil. I don't want to take too much time, and I'm going to stop here. I would like to come back on the fact that the UN is completely incapable of settling this issue. We'll have an opportunity to get back to this. Thank you, Eric Danon, for this very inspiring words. Now I'm going to turn to Judith Maida, because many, when talking about the Middle East, speak about the grave of the international law. You know this region very well. Middle East, Near East, and it's been for decades that the international community tries to find an issue to this very complex issue.
Je pense notamment aux accords d'Oslo. On a pu y croire avec les accords d'Oslo.
But in the end, after the Oslo agreement, it's always the enemies of peace that win. Faced with the situation for you, this is not impotence, it's more discouragement. How do you distinguish between someone who is discouraged and someone who is unable or impotent? Thank you. First, a big thanks to the region, also to the organizers, so Bertrand Badi, for having invited me here. It's a big honor for me to be here. The question is complicated. First, I would say that I absolutely agree with Eric Danon saying that this war is sadly going to last. It will last because it's lasted, because it started, I'm not going to get back to the centuries, it started in the 20th century. It starts in 1922. This is today the longest conflict that our world has known. After the end of the Irish conflict on the 10th of April 1988, the Good Friday Agreement, well, the last conflict that started in 1916, 1917 has found its end. That was the Irish conflict, and the Arab-Israeli conflict and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is continue. So we're going to ask ourselves how long. We can even more ask us a question that there is a paradox in this conflict. The State of Israel was created by the United Nations. The United Nations, they have taken up the Palestinian issue ever since. We recall since the San Remo Treaty at the moment, when the ancestor of the United Nations, which was called the Society of Nations, was created, and the Society of the Nations gave to the Great Britain the Palestinian mandate. And so this is an issue that was created in the 1920s. No solution. The European Jews are starting to move to Palestine. They're being held by the British. The Arabs resist, they revolt. We have a conflict, and then we have a dead end, just like today. I'm summarizing, we're in 1947. The UN again takes up this conflict and tells to the British that all they want, and the British said, we want to leave on 1948, and say, look, we have a solution. I'm just going to split Palestine in two. This is the splitting of Palestine in 29th of November 1947 with an important, there's two states being created, but we don't know what to do with Jerusalem. And then it's been that Jerusalem will be an open international city. It's the famous corpus separatum. It's a separate city, an open city, and we are going to handle it to the mandate. The mandate will be by the UN. The Arabs do not accept that. The Jews, well, we can only speak about Israel after 48, but the Jewish, the Hishur community says, oh, this is a fantastic opportunity. The Balfour Commission, the Balfour Declaration, had spoken about a national Jewish home. And here they inherit a state. And so we enter in a series of wars, which I'm not going to get back upon. And at the end, at all the time, the United Nations are always there. I'm not going to speak in front of the diplomats, take up this story again. 1948, 49, we say, okay, there's a resolution saying the Palestinians need to be able to go home. 1967, there's a six-day war. There's a resolution of the United Nations in relation to 240. 1973, the Kippur War, a new resolution of the UN. The 338, and then we have, as you mentioned it, 13th of September 1993, the Oslo Declaration, an extraordinary hope, and then we have the dead end in which we're stuck today. I want to answer today very quickly two questions. The first one is to try to understand why all this happened, why it didn't work, what did not work. If you can ask yourself the questions. In my diagnosis, I agree in many points with what Eric said, but I also have my disagreements. And I'll come back onto the grave of the mass grave of the international law. I would like to get back to that word term. Why didn't it not work? For numerous reasons. One of the reasons, as Bertrand Badi did a fantastic description of the violences of this epoch, in order to understand, I mean, I've been working in this region so long, and I've spoken to everyone, imaginary visions of the other. I think there's one element that's extraordinary. It's the cultural element. What accumulated over the centuries in this region, that is a hateful image. Since the wars were never ending, they were always ending up with mass killing. So entire generation passed on the lesson: we cannot live together. We cannot trust each other. They've killed your father. Yeah, but you killed my grandfather. From both sides, the same narrative. And that reminds me of a saying that from Karl Marx. Well, Karl Marx was asked, he was a great specialist who invented the dialectic materialism because he needed money and he was a refugee in London, and he was asked to write articles for the Times. And we was asked him to talk about the Irish War and to make his money, so he would write articles. He wrote one article, but then he gave up talking about the Irish conflict because he could not understand under the capitalist and material and dialectic point of view. And this fantastic expression coming from a sociologist, a philosopher who thinks about conflicts by the materiality of things, of the productive system. He had this sentence, which you never find in his writing, saying, is that the weight of the dead weighs very heavily on the brains of the living. Karl Marx, the transmission of the hate, the non-recognition of the pain of the others. And then starting with 1947, 48, or even 45, so we discover the horror of the Holocaust. This idea that the Jews who are running away from the concentration camps, who have been liberated from the concentration camps, and they settle by trying to overcome their pain, to try what Theodor Herzl said in his book, The State of the Jews, a refuge state, a state where you could find refuge. And the Palestinians on the other side, because you need to listen to the two stories, they're confronted with the Nakba, with this disaster, the catastrophe of 1948, where they have to flee their villages. And so what did not work very quickly? First of all, what didn't work is the very unbalanced recognition. The Oslo that was so celebrated, they said, we Palestinians, we PLO, Organization for the Liberation of Palestine, we recognize the state of Israel. But what do the Palestinians say on the other side? What do the Israelis say on the other side? They say, we recognize the PLO as being the representative, the Liberation Palestine, as being the representative of the Palestinian people. So there's an organization recognizing a state and a state recognizing a people. But what is forgotten in here, it's the crux of the matter, is that this people recognizes Israel, they want to have a state. And the state is a complete forgotten aspect of the Oslo agreement. And there's a second point, and here, Eric, I would like to have your point of view on this. There's also the responsibility of the actors in the conflict. There's two divergent dynamics. The first one is to say, we Palestinians, we recognize the state, we accept the Oslo point of view. Israel liberates territory, and we have this famous Palestinian Authority. But on the other hand, what is going on is that there is a colonization of the land. How do you reconcile that? The perception, and more than the perception, the reality of the colonization of West Jordan, and the hope of a recognition of a state. I think this is where really is the knot of the things. I'm stopping here, but we'll be able to take up the debate later on. Thank you. I think everyone's hungry at this stage. Impatient, yes, indeed. To widen the scope here with you, Professor Adebajo, We are going to look at the point of view of Africa, because if there's one continent of violences, of paradox, it's this one. Let's not forget 80% of the peacemaking mechanisms of the United Nations are deployed in Africa. This is where you have the most efforts and budgets, but with what results? You have developed, Professor Adebajo, you've developed a theory of the paradox of peacekeeping in Africa. Now that you want to nuance the theory, we're listening to you.
Thank you very much. I'm really here for the young people, and I was very shocked to see so many young people in Europe voting for fascist right-wing parties. And that's really the only reason that I've come today to present an alternative view, at least from a different part of the world. I want to attach myself right from the start to Agnes Callamard, because I think she made the most insightful interventions. First of all, I don't also think that this issue of non-state actors is new. I think non-state actors have been around Africa, at least, for 75 years. We had the MPLA and Frelimo in the 70s. We had the RUF and MPFL in Liberia and Sierra Leone in the 1990s. And so I think we shouldn't drift into a Western-centric view of the world. Interstate conflicts may be new in Europe, but both interstate conflicts and particularly intrastate conflicts are things that have been going on in Africa for at least the last 7 decades. So there's really nothing new about these conflicts and non-state actors. Secondly, the sort of social violence that was described in Kinshasa, for example, I would argue you can find that violence in the banlieue here in Paris. You can find that social violence in the US ghettos. You can find it in the Brazilian favelas as well. We must not exceptionalize Africa and make Africa some kind of poster child of conflict in the world. Third point I think that's important is that we must remember, and this again I thank Agnes for, because she introduced the issue of racism, which nobody wants to talk about, into the debate. 4 centuries of slavery, exporting 12 to 15 million Africans to the Americas to work on slave plantations for 4 centuries. Free labor helped to basically create and provide the profits for the industrialization of the West, and also help create the capitalist system. It also, in a way, had to be justified by racism, because you had to show Africans to be subhuman in order to be able to actually justify such a perverse and brutal system. And using these techniques, you then had a century of colonialism. And all of these countries, France, Britain, Portugal, Spain, Denmark, Sweden, were behind the slave trade, profited greatly from it. We must not run away from this truth and this reality. And then you had a triple event in Africa, which was the Cold War. And the Soviet Union, the US, launched proxy wars into Africa. France acted, I believe it was Mitterrand who described France as behaving like a pyromaniac fireman in Africa, where you would basically shuffle around regimes like deranged poker players. And France would support all sorts of autocrats and dictators like Bokassa, etc. And that is why France has been so discredited in the Sahel today, and why the French military has been expelled from Burkina Faso, from Mali, from Niger. And I think all of the military bases in Africa, for France, for the US, the Russian Wagner Group, the Chinese base, all of them need to be dismantled in order for Africa to actually have peace. So it's very important to understand that context. And what Agnes is talking about is what the Kenyan scholar Ali Mazrui described as global apartheid. There is a system of global apartheid where different rules apply to different groups, and almost like an international caste system where you have the Brahmins on top, the rich Brahmins, and then you have the untouchable Dalits at the bottom of this system. And I think the importance of the United Nations, you can say that peacekeeping, most peacekeepers of the UN are in Africa, but only 0.5% of the cost of peacekeeping is equivalent to the global spending on military. So peacekeeping is just a band-aid. It's not actually where most of the military spending is going. But I think the more important thing is how do we actually rebuild multilateralism? And that's what the Summit of the Future was about. The main pillars of multilateralism are peace and security, sustainable development, and human rights. And all of them are crumbling. Part of the reason is that these Western-created Bretton Woods institutions that we've heard about, the West still wants to maintain the weighted voting and its power within those institutions. And so they don't want to actually have discussions on sustainable development within the United Nations and within the Economic and Social Council, which would be more advantageous for the Global South. I think another point that's important is the kind of damage that the IMF and World Bank have had in Africa and much of the Global South. In the 1980s, the World Bank and IMF were pushing the structural adjustment programs that did great damage to education, to health, and public services in much of Africa. And much of Africa has not recovered from a lot of that damage, which they're still trying to kind of ameliorate. The other issue that I think is important is that if you look at peace and security, Africa has actually had a tremendous impact and influence in peace and security. The first two Secretaries General of the United Nations after the Cold War were two Africans, Boutros Ghali, an Egyptian, and Kofi Annan, a Ghanaian. And the framework and architecture which we're using today of peacemaking, peacekeeping, and peace building was developed as a result of an agenda for peace by Boutros Ghali, which we're still using today and updating. And Kofi Annan had innovations like the UN Human Rights Council and also the UN Peacebuilding Commission. They're not working perfectly and need to be capacitated, but I think we need to at least acknowledge this. The other point that I think is also important, and this comes to the peacekeeping paradox, is that African armies have made huge sacrifices in going into countries like Liberia and Sierra Leone and Somalia, but they don't have the finance and the logistics to do the job. The UN and the international community are more capable, but they don't seem to be willing to go into African conflicts. And so what we're getting now is at least the UN agreeing to capacitate African regional bodies a bit more. But it's also important to avoid an aristocracy of death where it's Africans that are doing most of the dying in peacekeeping missions in what should be basically global responsibilities. And 40% of UN peacekeepers currently are African. The UN Security Council also is important to reform. I think it's important to note that.
This is something that we talk about almost every year.
But it's important to make the point here, especially for your young people, so they understand. At the time that the UN was created, the UN Security Council represented 8% of the world, of the international community. Today it represents 22%. Africa is 28% of that membership, but has no permanent representative. So countries like Nigeria, South Africa, Brazil, India, also need to be given a chance to join that international body. So my main point is that we need to reverse this global apartheid at the heart of the international system.
Bravo, je
Merci.
pense qu'on vous a très très bien compris, professeur Adebajo.
Thank you, Professor Adebajo. I think we perfectly heard what you wanted to say. And I would like to say that it is specifically a specificity of our forum, Normandy for Peace, is that you are really welcome to come here, to present your point of view and your position and your feeling. Thank you. That is something I wanted to clarify. We spoke about the Middle East and Africa, of course, Hervé Moritz. What about Europe? I recall that you are the president of the European movement in France. Very often we talk about the complete, it's almost become common saying to say that Europe is incapable of something, but we've seen Europe being able to react very quickly. Many people were surprised who looked at the COVID crisis of the war in Ukraine, with the common point, the capacity finally of the states to question themselves, and it illustrates the famous wisdom that says it's crisis that Europe along. So tumbling down the taboos one after, is that the price to pay for a powerful Europe? Thank you. I would like to thank you for having invited me. I also would like to thank all the organizers for this fantastic forum. I'm really impressed by the number of people present here. It's the first time that I speak in front of my almost homonym, Hervé Morin. That is funny. You asked me to speak about Europe, and it's true that in this round table on the new forms of violence around the world, this really echoes with the issues with the Europeans, and I wanted to start by speaking about these issues. These new violences, they also show what the Europeans are worried about. Today, when we look at the opinion surveys in Europe, we see that Europeans are worried about the new violences, insecurities because of the return of war on the European soil. And clearly, in the surveys, the war in Ukraine is a major worry for the Europeans. But when we spoke about the violences that are linked to climate change, when we speak about other violences, social inequalities, or maybe a fear of decline of the level of the life quality of life, that's also something that you find among the main worries among the European people. What is interesting in these opinion surveys is that the Europeans, when they talk about these issues, they also express expectations vis-à-vis the European Union in order to meet these challenges. And when we look at the Eurobarometer, so these big opinion surveys that we do at the European-wide level, the Europeans are expecting from Europe that it acts against climate change, that is leadership that is recognized to Europe on the climate issue for the green transitions in order to achieve this green transition at the level of the continent, but also that it be active in terms of security and defense, public health. All these are areas where for a long time the Europeans have been unable to actually really commit to a true implement a true transition and be able to meet these new challenges. Today, if we want to respond to these issues expressed by the Europeans that are raised by these new violences, we need to ask the questions: why is Europe so unable to stand up and to rally around this issue? And what is the price to be paid for that? There's a report I like to get back to when I have these type of debates. This is a survey, a report that was commissioned in the 1980s. It's a regularly recurring report on the cost of how much does it cost if Europe does not act? How much does non-Europe cost? Our incapacity of building Europe has a cost. And it's interesting because the European Parliament since 1980 is trying to establish the cost of this in the economical sector, in the defense sector, in the area of the digital and of research, for instance. And it's interesting because it's a cost of incapacity that we cultivate in certain areas where we have troubles we can't agree as Europeans, that we decide to let it slide or not act, and we don't give ourselves the capacities to be powerful on these specific issues. And this cost of non-Europe, I find that it illustrates very well our modern challenges, and we spoke about the nationalisms or the use that votes for populist and nationalist parties in Europe. And it's interesting because when Europe does not provide responses, people go and look for responses in these nationalist alternatives, even though these nationalist alternatives, because the European project was an alternative to these nationalism that have been responsible for the war in Europe. And so when we try to answer these nationalism, we do not build a powerful project in response, a collective power project, a European power project. And this is what we need to be able to develop. And it's true in a certain number of areas, but...
Yes. Just to conclude, what you just said, Harry Moritz, is that when you try to see the powerlessness, we try to fall back to and adopt nationalism, but they are the expectations of Europeans, of European citizens, and it's to do with what the decision makers will do. Let's give the example of the EU. If it happened because it was based on reconciliation of Germany and France, because we have two men, Charles de Gaulle and the Konrad Adenauer, who managed to overcome what were considered to be impossible to overcome, and being able to build the EU. Do you think that in the Middle East that the problem is that we have a problem with incarnation? You said at the beginning of your presentation that some people don't want the war to end, but as long as decision makers and politicians do not agree to this, and not the populations, will be able to find a solution. How do we tackle this problem of what I call incarnation? And we managed to find a solution in Europe. So what about the Middle East? It's a real question, the question of war and peace, man, woman, politicians and decision makers. This is absolutely fundamental. And when we look at the Middle East, I spent 4 years in the Middle East. When we have on one side we have Benjamin Netanyahu, on the other side we have Mahmoud Abbas. We cannot have a solution. Not everyone can be Charles de Gaulle and Konrad Adenauer. We need to find someone who can make peace with the other party. Once again, it's costly, it's expensive. It means that in the Middle East and in other regions of the world, if you are really in favor of peace, you have good probabilities of being shot or killed, assassinated. But let's not despair. We are in the current situation where it doesn't work. But when you compare with Europe, de Gaulle, Adenauer, these countries were superpowers, and I would say they were superpowers getting back in shape. I mean, they were surviving something important. But let's look at Palestine and Israel, the former Palestine as under the mandate of the UK. This area is smaller than Normandy. Just imagine this. We are fighting, and we're fighting with an extreme level of violence in an area. We are approximately at 31,000 square kilometers, but we are fighting around the Jordan River. And in this region is even narrower than the Rhone River in Normandy, and people have been fighting for millennia and millennia, for 3,000 years, but everything is sacred. And when you are in an environment where everything is sacred, when in Jerusalem each rock, each people is sacred, everything becomes a symbol. And it's very difficult to find the politicians, the right politicians, to be the symbols of history, of geography, and the symbol of the region. Unfortunately, we only have 5 minutes left, and we have Mr. Myla who wanted to say something, and we'd have to conclude in the next 5 minutes. Moving on to Bertrand. Bertrand, I will try. I think this is something we forgot to say. And I think absolutely crucial is that the wars of yesterday were wars of rivalry, a competition among superpowers. But now most of the wars take place in order for domination on revolt, a protest against domination. When you are rivals and when you are dominated, you don't adopt the same behavior. When you have dominated, you're oppressed, you're excluded. You don't recognize you, we don't acknowledge you. But when you rival, it's your equals, and you are fighting among equals. If they are cousins, and you need to acknowledge that the new types of violence are based on humiliation. And if someone is humiliated, is not recognized, acknowledged, well, they enraged. The new types of violence are based on humiliation. Mr. Mylov, to conclude, let me go back to what Eric rightfully said. In these war processes, there's a moment of incarnation. We need to have someone embodying peace. In 1993, we have Rabin, Shimon Peres, even Yasser Arafat even said that the charter, the Palestinian charter, who wanted the destruction of Israel, was no longer relevant. That's what he said in Paris. But I think that behind this incarnation of power, the embodiment of peace, there's a deep recognition of the hurt, the suffering, the damage suffered by people. And let me go back to South Africa, and that will be my conclusion. Desmond Tutu who said once that when we asked Mr. the Archbishop Desmond Tutu, you need to know to turn the page. And Desmond Tutu said, yes, you must be able to turn the page and turn the pages, but once you've read them.
Encore une fois, qui clôt notre...
Thank you very much. Amazing. This is the conclusion of the first session. Each of the speakers, you can meet them again this afternoon and tomorrow. We could spend hours listening to you. A big, big round of applause for all our speakers, and let's meet again at 2 p.m. We have another plenary session, and we have a very interesting panelist to talk about the fight for freedom. How can we protect the protectors of peace? This will be the title of this afternoon session, and let's meet again at 2 p.m. and enjoy your lunch.